The enemy commander raised his hand on the ridge above the valley and gave the signal to kill. One gunshot. That was the order. In seconds, 8 American Navy SEALs were trapped in a canyon of solid rock, fire pouring in from 3 directions. Their only road out already sealed by machine guns they never saw coming. Before we go any further, if you believe men like these deserve to be remembered, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very last word of this story. Drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Ethan Walker heard the shot before he understood what it meant. One crack, high and sharp, bouncing off stone. For half a second, his mind tried to file it away as nothing. A loose rock, a hunting rifle from some farmer 3 ridge lines over. 12 years in the teams had taught him to listen for the lie before he listened for the truth, and some old animal part of his brain wanted this to be the lie. It wasn't. The valley answered the shot with everything it had. Machine gun fire opened up from the north ridge in a wall of green tracer rounds, chewing into the rocks around his team so fast that the noise didn't even sound like gunfire anymore. It sounded like the mountain itself tearing open. "Contact! Contact 3 sides!" Jake Sullivan's voice cracked over the team net, and Ethan was already moving, already counting his men out of habit before he could stop himself. 1, 2, 3. "Get down! Everybody down now!" Danny Coleman was closest to him, the youngest operator on the team, 26 years old and still built like the wrestler he had been in high school. Ethan grabbed a fistful of his vest and hauled him behind a boulder just as a burst of rounds sparked off the rock where Coleman had been standing. "You good? Coleman, you good?" I'm good, Cap. I'm good." He wasn't good. Nobody was good. Not yet, they just didn't know it. Ethan came up on one knee, weapon in the shoulder, scanning the north ridge. Muzzle flashes stitched a line across the rocks up there, at least 2, maybe 3 positions. "Eastern Cliffs, movement, Eastern Cliffs." That was Tyler Briggs, dug into a low wall of stone 30 feet to Ethan's right, his voice tight but level. Briggs had done 4 deployments. He didn't panic. He reported. Ethan swung his eyes east and his stomach dropped. Not just rifles, a rocket team. "RPG! RPG! East Ridge! Everybody move! Move!" The rocket screamed in low and hit 10 feet from where Sam Ortiz had been kneeling half a second earlier, and the blast picked Ortiz up off the ground and threw him sideways into a rock wall like he weighed nothing. "Man down! Ortiz is down!" Doc! Marcus Harmon, the team's medic, already had his aid bag off his back before Ethan finished shouting the word. Harmon was actually crawling, across open ground with rounds cracking overhead. Because that was the job. That had always been the job. And he reached Ortiz and rolled him, and Ortiz was cursing, loud, furious, alive. I'm hit, my leg, son of a... You're talking. That means you're breathing. Shut up and let me look," Harmon snapped. And there was something almost tender in how harsh he said it. Shrapnel. Ugly, bleeding, but the leg was still attached. The bone wasn't showing. Harmon wrapped it fast, hands moving on pure muscle memory while his eyes never stopped scanning the ridgeline. That was 1. Ethan didn't have time to feel relief before the north ridge opened up again. Heavier this time. And he understood with a cold, clean certainty that this hadn't been an accident. This hadn't been bad luck. This was a trap built and waiting, and his team had walked into the center of it. "Command, this is Phantom Team. We are in heavy contact, I say again. Heavy contact. Request immediate support." Static. Then a voice, calm, too calm, the calm of someone sitting in an air-conditioned room 500 miles away. "Phantom Team, command copies contact. Stand by for support options." Negative. We do not have time to stand by." Another RPG came in, closer this time, and Ethan threw himself flat as rock and dust rained down across his back. When he lifted his head, Nathan Cole, the team's designated marksman, was already up on one knee, rifle tracking, and he fired 3 rounds in a rhythm so smooth it almost didn't look real. One of the muzzle flashes on the north ridge went dark and stayed dark. "Got one," Cole said, flat, already moving his scope to the next target. "One down? How many more?" "Eastern Cliffs reloading," Briggs called out. "They're gonna send another one. Get ready." Ethan's mind was running triage even as bullets cracked past his head, doing the terrible arithmetic every commander learns to do without wanting to. Ortiz wounded but stable. 6 men still fully in the fight. One rocket team east, at least two machine gun positions north, unknown numbers on whatever was blocking their exit. Sully, what's our southern route look like? Jake Sullivan risked a look, ducked back down as rounds sparked off the stone beside his head, and when he answered, his voice had gone thin. Cap, southern route's got movement too. I think they've got us boxed. The words landed like a physical blow. Boxed. Three sides of fire, and the fourth side wasn't clear either. Say that again. I'm seeing shapes moving on the south wall. Could be two, could be four. I can't confirm, but Cap, I don't think there's a clean way out. For one terrible second, Ethan Walker, a man who had never once in his career let his team see him afraid, felt something cold slide down his spine. He pushed it down. There wasn't room for it. Not now. Copy. We hold here. We consolidate. We figure this out. Everybody stays alive. That's the only order that matters right now. Roger that, Cole said, and fired again. Another muzzle flash on the north ridge died. 2. The firefight settled into something almost like a rhythm. Ugly and violent, but a rhythm. Bursts of fire answered by bursts of fire, the team using the terrain, using each other, covering, moving, covering again. For a few minutes, Ethan let himself believe they could hold this. Attrition favored them. His men were better trained, better positioned now that they'd found cover, and every few minutes another enemy position went quiet under Cole's rifle or Briggs' careful, controlled bursts. Then the mountain lit up with a new kind of fire, and Ethan understood how wrong he'd been. "They're flanking!" Ortiz shouted from where Harmon had him propped against a rock, weapon still up despite the wound in his leg. "Movement west! They're coming around west!" A fourth side, there had never been a gap. There had only been a position they hadn't opened yet, waiting, patient, until the team was fully fixed in place. "Command, this is Phantom Team. Enemy has flanked our position. We are now fully surrounded. I need air support right now." This time the voice on the other end wasn't calm anymore. "Phantom Team, be advised, nearest fixed-wing asset is currently 30 minutes from your position." 30 minutes. Ethan actually laughed, one short, humorless breath, because the number was so obscene it almost stopped making sense as a real measurement of time. 30 minutes, he repeated into the radio, and even he could hear how flat his voice had gone. "Command, did you copy? 30 minutes? We do not have 30 minutes." "Copy, Phantom Team. We are working every available option. Be advised, rotary wing assets are grounded due to weather at forward operating base. Fixed wing is your fastest option at this time." Weather somewhere far away in a place where the sky was simply cloudy instead of on fire. Weather was the reason his men might die. Another burst of fire ripped across the position, and Ethan dropped flat, felt a round crack pass close enough to feel the air move, and came back up breathing hard. "Sully, get me anything else. Anything. AWACS, Apache, a damn crop duster. I don't care. Find me something closer than 30 minutes. Sullivan was already working the radio, voice fast, professional, terrified underneath the professionalism. "Command, this is Phantom Team requesting any and all available close air support assets in the region. We need options faster than 30 mics. For a moment, nothing, just the gunfire, the ringing in Ethan's ears, the smell of burnt powder and rock dust. Then command came back, and for one heartbeat, hope. "Phantom Team, be advised, we have an AC-130 gunship on station approximately 40 miles from your position, attempting to establish contact now." 40 miles. Ethan did the math without wanting to, and it still came out better than 30 minutes. His chest loosened just slightly. Copy that. Get them on station. We need that gunship." "Stand by." The standby stretched on. 30 seconds. A minute. 2 rounds cracked into the rock a foot from Coleman's head, and the young operator flinched hard, cursed, came back up firing. "Command, Phantom Team. Status on that gunship?" The answer, when it came, gutted him. "Phantom Team, be advised that gunship has been redirected to a higher priority tasking. It is no longer available to support your position. I say again, that asset is no longer available." Ethan felt something in his chest crack. Redirected? Redirected to what? We have a team surrounded, one wounded, taking fire from 4 directions. What is a higher priority than that? Silence on the other end. The kind of silence that meant somebody somewhere had made a decision. And there was no version of this conversation where that decision got explained to him in the middle of a firefight. Copy command, he said finally, because there was nothing else to say. No fight to pick with a radio. Advise fastest available asset. Fastest available remains the fixed wing element, currently at 28 minutes to your position. 28 minutes. It had gotten 2 minutes better. It might as well have gotten 2 years better. It still wasn't fast enough. And Ethan knew it. And worse, he knew his team could hear every word of this over the net. Cap. Harmon's voice, tight, urgent, cutting through everything else. Cap, I need you over here. Something in the way Harmon said it made Ethan's blood run cold before he even turned around. He crawled low, fast, ignoring the rounds still snapping overhead, and found Harmon kneeling not over Ortiz anymore, but over Danny Coleman. And the ground under Coleman was dark, too dark, spreading. When did he get hit? When did he get hit? I don't know, 30 seconds ago maybe. He didn't even say anything. He just went down. Harmon's hands were already moving, already tearing open Coleman's vest, already pressing, and his voice had dropped into the flat, controlled register medics used when things were bad, when panic was a luxury nobody could afford. Entry wound, upper thigh, it's the femoral, Cap. It's the femoral artery. I need pressure on this now. Ethan's hands went down without thought, pressing where Harmon told him to press, feeling the warm blood pulse against his palms with a rhythm that terrified him because he understood exactly what that rhythm meant. Coleman, look at me. Coleman's eyes found his, glassy, scared, 26 years old and trying so hard not to show it. Am I gonna die, Cap? No, you're not. You hear me? Not today. Not on my watch. That's what everybody says right before. I don't care what everybody says. I'm saying it and I mean it. Doc, talk to me. Talk to me right now. Harmon's face told him everything before his mouth caught up. I can slow it. I can't stop it. Not out here, not with what I've got. Cap, he needs a surgical team. He needs one fast. How fast? Harmon looked up, and for just a second the calm cracked. Just enough for Ethan to see the fear underneath it. Fear for a man he'd bled alongside for 3 years. 10 minutes? Maybe 12 if I keep the pressure perfect and he doesn't move and God smiles on us. After that, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. 10 to 12 minutes, 28 minutes out. Ethan Walker had led men through some of the worst places on earth. He had made calls that cost lives and calls that saved them. And he had always found some version of a way forward. But kneeling in the dirt with his hands pressed against a wound that was killing one of his own men in real time, doing math that simply, mathematically, did not work no matter how many times he ran it, he felt something he had never let himself feel in 12 years of war. Helplessness. Command, this is Phantom Team. Be advised, we now have one critical casualty, femoral bleed, survival window 10 to 12 minutes. I need that asset moving now. Do you copy? 10 minutes. Copy, Phantom Team. Understood. We are pushing that asset to maximum speed. Current estimate remains 25 minutes to your position. 25 minutes to save a man who had 10. Bullets kept coming. The mountain kept shaking. Cole fired again, took out a third position on the North Ridge. And it barely mattered anymore because the math was the math, and the math said Danny Coleman was going to bleed out in this valley while the rest of them watched. Doc, is there anything? Anything? I'm doing everything there is to do, Cap. There isn't a magic trick here. I need a bird in the air, and I need it now, and I don't have that. So all I've got is pressure and prayer, and prayer's never been my strong suit. Coleman's breathing had gone shallow, fast, his skin turning the color of old paper under the dust and blood. Cap. His voice was barely a whisper now, barely audible over the gunfire. Tell my mom. Tell her I wasn't scared. You're going to tell her yourself. You hear me, Coleman? Look at me. You're going to tell her yourself. But even as he said it, even as he poured every ounce of certainty he had left into those words, Ethan Walker did not believe them. He looked up at the ridgeline, at the smoke, at the impossible math written in blood on the ground in front of him, and for the first time in his career, he understood that there was nothing left in his training, nothing in 12 years of combat experience, nothing in the entire United States military's chain of command that was going to arrive in time. 25 minutes, 10 to 12. Somewhere out there, 500 miles from this valley, help existed. It was real, it was coming. It just wasn't coming fast enough. And there, kneeling in the dirt with his hands slick with the blood of a man he had promised to bring home, Ethan Walker did something he had never once done in front of his team. He prayed, not for himself, not for victory, just for time, for a miracle, for anything, anyone out there in that empty sky who might somehow, impossibly, impossibly hear them. He didn't know it yet. He couldn't have known it. But 500 miles away, in a cockpit that had no business being anywhere near this fight, someone already had. 200 miles northeast, in a sky so calm it almost felt like it belonged to a different planet, Captain Olivia Carter leveled her A-10 Thunderbolt II out of a lazy turn and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Valkyrie flight, how copy?" crackled the voice of her wingman, Lieutenant Ray Dawson, flying loose formation off her right wing. "Copy 5x5, Dawson. This is about as exciting as watching paint dry." "Don't jinx it. I like boring. Boring means we land, we eat, we go home." Olivia almost smiled behind her oxygen mask. Dawson had been her wingman for 8 months, and in that time she'd learned exactly 2 things about him. He complained about every training sortie like it personally offended him, and he was one of the steadiest hands she'd ever flown with when things actually went sideways. Today wasn't supposed to be one of those days. Today was a scheduled range mission. Nothing more low-level navigation and weapons familiarization over terrain that hadn't seen real combat in months. Routine. Boring, exactly like Dawson wanted. She scanned her instruments out of habit, fuel state good, systems green, and let her mind drift for just a second to the letter sitting unopened on her kitchen table back at the squadron. The one from her father. The one she still hadn't found the courage to read. Later, she'd deal with it later. Static crackled through her headset, not on her assigned frequency, bleed over the kind of stray transmission that happens sometimes when multiple nets overlapped on adjacent frequencies in a crowded piece of airspace. She almost dismissed it. Almost, because underneath the static, buried in the noise, she caught 3 words that made every hair on her arm stand up. "Man down, we need..." Gone, swallowed by static again. Olivia's hand moved to her radio panel before her brain had even finished processing what she'd heard. "Dawson, you catching that? Something's bleeding onto our frequency." "Yeah, I got a snippet. Probably just cross traffic. Happens all the time out here." She wanted to believe that. She wanted badly for this to be nothing. Some administrative net. Some training exercise 100 miles away that had nothing to do with her. She adjusted her frequency scan, walking it slowly across the band. Hunting. There. Stronger this time. "Say again, we are in heavy contact, 4 directions. I need immediate air support. This is not a drill." Every muscle in Olivia's body went rigid. That wasn't training chatter. Nobody rehearsed a voice like that. She had heard fear in radio transmissions before. Real fear, the kind that lived in the space between words. And she was hearing it now, raw and unfiltered, crackling through her headset from somewhere out there in the mountains. "Dawson, Dawson, I've got a live transmission. This is real world. Somebody's in contact." "What? Where?" "I don't know yet. Hold on." She keyed nothing, just listened, leaning into the static like she could physically pull the signal closer. Another voice, different from the first, tighter, more controlled. "Entry wound, upper thigh. It's the femoral cap. It's the femoral artery. I need pressure on this now." Olivia's stomach dropped straight through the floor of her cockpit. Ephemeral bleed. She knew exactly what that meant. She'd sat through enough combat medicine briefings to understand the brutal, unforgiving clock that started ticking the moment an artery like that got torn open. Minutes. Not hours. Minutes. "Dawson, somebody out there has a man bleeding out. This is a live TIC, troops in contact, and it sounds bad." "Okay, so that's command's problem, right? Somebody's already responding. That's not us, Carter. We're a training flight. We're not armed for combat, no, but we've got the GAU-8 loaded for the range, and that cannon doesn't know the difference between a target on a gunnery range and a real one." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough that Olivia could picture the look on Dawson's face even without seeing it. "You are not thinking what I think you're thinking." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached down and pulled up her navigation display, fingers moving fast, professional. The same hands that had flown 100 training sorties, now doing something that felt entirely different. She triangulated the signal strength, cross-referenced it against the terrain map, and a rough position bloomed onto her screen. A valley. Deep, narrow, exactly the kind of terrain that turned a firefight into a death trap because there was nowhere to run. Command, this is Valkyrie 1. Be advised we are receiving what sounds like live troops in contact on a bleed-over frequency, requesting information. Over. Nothing. Command Valkyrie 1, radio check, over. Still nothing. Just the crackle of empty air, and underneath it, if she strained hard enough, the faint ghost of that same desperate voice still calling for help that clearly, agonizingly hadn't arrived yet. They're not even hearing me, Olivia said half to herself. We're too far off their assigned net. Then let it go. Seriously, Carter, this isn't ours to fix. There's a whole chain of command whose entire job is exactly this. Let them do their job. Olivia's jaw tightened. Everything Dawson was saying was true. Every regulation, every procedure, every year of training had built a structure specifically designed to handle situations like this one. A structure she was not officially part of today. She wasn't tasked. She wasn't briefed. She had no authorization, no clearance, no orders. She switched frequencies again, hunting for the primary channel. And this time she caught it clean, strong, close enough that whoever was transmitting had to be relatively near her own position. Command, this is Phantom Team. Be advised we now have one critical casualty, femoral bleed, survival window 10 to 12 minutes. I need that asset moving now. Do you copy? 10 minutes. The voice was raw, cracked at the edges, a man barely holding himself together through sheer force of will, and Olivia felt something twist violently in her chest at the sound of it. Then, worse, the reply. Copy Phantom Team. Understood. We are pushing that asset to maximum speed. Current estimate remains 25 minutes to your position. 25 minutes. Olivia did the math instantly, the way pilots always did math, fast and automatic, and the number that came back made her physically sick. 25 minutes against a 10 to 12-minute clock. Somebody out there was going to doing nothing wrong except trusting that help was coming, and help was going to be almost 15 minutes too late. Dawson, did you hear that? I heard it. 25 minutes. He's got 10. I know what I heard, Carter. Dawson's voice had lost its complaining edge now, replaced by something quieter, more careful. But that's still not our call to make. We divert off our flight and plan without authorization into an active combat zone and use live ordnance without clearance. In best case, we're facing an investigation that ends both our careers. Worst case, we make things worse. We don't know that terrain. We don't know friendly positions. We could hit our own guys. Every word of it was a fair point. Olivia knew that. She had spent her entire career respecting exactly the kind of caution Dawson was describing, because that caution existed for good reasons. Because pilots who acted on impulse got people killed just as easily as pilots who hesitated. But then she thought about the voice on the radio, 10 to 12 minutes. She thought about a man somewhere below her, bleeding out on rock and dirt while a clock ran down that no amount of procedure was going to slow. She pulled up her navigation display again, did the calculation properly this time, distance and airspeed and fuel burn, and the number that came back nearly stopped her heart. 6 minutes. 6 minutes to reach that valley, versus 25 for the asset actually tasked to respond. Dawson, I can be there in 6 minutes. Silence. 6 minutes, Ray. That man doesn't have 25. He might not even have 12, but he might have 6. Olivia. He almost never used her first name over the radio. Think about what you're saying. You divert without clearance. You're done. Not suspended, done. They pull your wings. Maybe worse. And if I don't, a man dies who didn't have to. You don't know that for certain. Command said they're pushing the asset to max speed. Maybe they beat that estimate. Maybe isn't good enough when somebody's counting down from 10. Her voice had gone hard now, flat, the same voice she used on final approach when there was no more room left for doubt. I heard him, Ray. I heard his voice. That wasn't a training exercise. That was real. She keyed her bradder one more time, tried command again, gave them her position, her situation, requested immediate authorization to divert and provide close air support to the unit in contact. She waited. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Valkyrie 1, this is command. Be advised, unable to authorize unplanned diversion at this time. Maintain current flight plan. We say again, maintain current flight plan and await further instruction. There it was, the answer she'd been afraid of and somehow already expecting. Denied. She sat with that word for exactly 2 seconds, feeling the entire weight of everything it meant pressing down on her chest, her career, her reputation, everything she had built across 9 years in the Air Force balanced on the edge of a decision nobody was authorizing her to make. Then she thought about that voice again. 10 to 12 minutes. Copy command, she said, and something in her tone made even Dawson go quiet on the other end. Understood. She banked the aircraft hard enough that the horizon spun sideways in her canopy and pointed the nose directly at the coordinates she'd triangulated from a stranger's desperate radio call. Olivia, what are you doing? You just heard them say negative. I heard them say negative to authorization, Ray. I didn't hear anybody tell me that man's allowed to die. They will pull your wings for this. I am telling you right now, they will pull your wings. Then they can pull them after I land. Her hands moved across the cockpit with a calm that surprised even her. Throttle forward, systems check, weapons selector confirmed live. I'm not asking you to come with me. This is my call, not yours. Break off if you need to, I mean that. No hard feelings. There was a long pause, long enough that Olivia genuinely believed for a moment that she was about to fly into the valley completely alone. Then Dawson's voice came back, and underneath the fear in it was something else, something that sounded almost like respect. Like hell, I'm letting you fly into a hot valley by yourself. I'm coming. But if we both get court-martialed, I want it on record that I said this was insane. Noted, Olivia said, and for the first time in the last 90 seconds, allowed herself a small, tight smile. Let's go get them. The 2 aircraft came around together, engines screaming, and dropped low toward the mountains, racing a clock that only one of them could actually hear. Down in the valley, that clock had already turned vicious. Ethan Walker still had both hands pressed against Danny Coleman's leg, feeling the young operator's pulse growing weaker under his palms with every passing second, when the North Ridge opened again with a ferocity that told him the enemy had realized something important. They were winning, and they knew it. Cap, they're pushing forward, Briggs shouted from his position, firing controlled bursts even as rounds chewed into the rock inches from his head. They know we're stuck. They're advancing. Hold the line, do not let them close the distance. Cole fired twice more, dropped a 4th position on the ridge, but even as one gun went silent, 2 more opened up to replace it. The enemy wasn't just persistent, they were reinforcing. Where the hell are they getting more shooters? Ortiz growled, dragging himself up against a rock despite the wound in his leg, weapon back in his shoulder, because lying still while his teammates fought wasn't something his body would allow even when his leg was screaming at him to stop. Ortiz, stay down. You're bleeding. I'm bleeding. I'm not dead, and we need every gun we've got, Cap. Let me shoot. Ethan didn't have time to argue. He didn't have time for anything except the terrible mathematics still running behind his eyes. 10 to 12 minutes on Coleman's clock. 25, now closer to 23, on Command's clock. The gap between those 2 numbers was where his teammate's life was going to end, and there was nothing he could do about the arithmetic no matter how hard he pressed on the wound in front of him. Doc, talk to me. Harmon's hands were slick red to the wrist, his voice tighter than Ethan had ever heard it. Pressure's holding for now, but Cap, he's losing color, his pulse is getting thready. I can buy him time. I can't buy him 25 minutes. Coleman's eyes fluttered, half open, unfocused. Cap. His voice had gone to almost nothing. Is it bad? Tell me straight. Ethan looked down at the young man he'd recruited himself 3 years ago. The kid who used to talk about his mother's cooking on every single deployment brief, like it was the most important intelligence in the room. And he made a decision in that half second the same way he'd made every hard decision in his career. Fast, certain, refusing to let the fear show on his face even as it tore through his chest. It's bad, he said, but you're tougher than bad. You hear me? You've survived worse than this. Never been shot before? First time for everything. Doesn't mean it's the last time you get to talk about it. A weak, pained, almost laugh escaped Coleman's lips, and somehow that small, broken sound was the thing that nearly broke Ethan more than anything else that had happened in the last 15 minutes. Command, Phantom Team, status update on that asset. Phantom Team, be advised current estimate 2-3 minutes to your position. 23. It had barely moved. 2 minutes shaved off in what felt like an eternity of gunfire and blood, and a young man's pulse fading under his hands. 23 minutes isn't going to save him. Do you understand me? Do you people understand what you're telling me? Silence. Not even an apology. Just dead air. Because there was nothing Command could say that would change the physics of distance and time. Then, cutting through the static, something new. Something that made every man in that valley go still for half a second. A voice. Different from Command. Different from anything they'd heard all day. Phantom Team, this is Valkyrie 1. I say again, Valkyrie 1, do you copy? Ethan's head snapped up. Radio pressed hard against his ear, certain he'd misheard through the ringing in his ears and the gunfire still cracking around them. Say again, unknown station. Say again. Who is this? Phantom Team, this is Valkyrie 1. I am inbound to your position. I say again, I am inbound, requesting your exact grid and situation report. Over. Sullivan, crouched beside him, stared at Ethan with wide, disbelieving eyes. Cap, who the hell is that? That's not Command's frequency. Ethan didn't know. He genuinely, completely did not know who was on the other end of that transmission. Whether it was real, whether it was some kind of confusion, some overlap of frequencies that meant nothing at all. But he had learned a long time ago that when you're drowning, you don't ask too many questions about the hand reaching down to pull you out. Valkyrie 1, this is Phantom Team Actual. We are in heavy contact, surrounded 4 directions, 1 critical casualty, femoral bleed, survival window under 10 minutes. We need immediate support. I say again, immediate support. Do you copy? There was a pause, brief, and when the voice came back, it had changed, lost some of its formal edge, gained something else instead, something that sounded impossibly like fierce and absolute determination. Copy all, Phantom Team. I have your position. I am 6 minutes out. I say again, 6 minutes. 6 minutes. The number hit the valley like a physical shockwave. Sullivan's mouth actually fell open. Briggs, still firing, still holding his position, let out a short, sharp laugh that had no humor in it at all, just pure, disbelieving relief. 6 minutes, Ethan repeated into the radio, and for the first time in 15 minutes, something that wasn't dread moved through his chest. Valkyrie, confirm. You said 6 minutes? Confirmed, Phantom Team. I'm diverting to your location now. Hold what you've got. I'm coming. Ethan looked down at Coleman, whose eyes had drifted half-closed again, whose breathing had gone shallow and fast in that way Harmon's face told him was very, very bad. Coleman, you hear that? Help's coming. 6 minutes. Coleman's eyes cracked open, found Ethan's face, and for just a second, something like hope flickered across them. 6 minutes, he whispered. I can do 6 minutes. Damn right you can. But even as Ethan said it, even as that fragile thread of hope wound its way through the whole team, another voice cut across the radio net. Cold, formal, unmistakably a command voice, and it wasn't coming from the valley at all. Unknown station identifying as Valkyrie 1, be advised you are not tasked to this location. You are ordered to break off and maintain your assigned flight plan immediately. Ethan's blood went cold. Somebody up the chain had heard what was happening, and somebody up the chain was trying to stop it. Valkyrie, do you copy that last transmission? Ethan said into his radio, dread creeping back into his voice, even as hope had barely had time to settle. They're telling you to turn back. The pause that followed felt like it lasted a lifetime. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel Coleman's pulse fluttering weaker under his fingers, could hear the gunfire still hammering against the rocks around him, and he waited for an answer that would either save his team or confirm that the miracle he'd just been handed was about to be taken away. Then her voice came back, steady, unwavering, cutting through every ounce of doubt in that valley like a blade. Phantom Team, this is Valkyrie 1. I hear you loud and clear. I am not breaking off. Somewhere behind her in the cockpit of the second aircraft, Dawson's voice crackled with something between terror and awe. Olivia, that's a direct order. They are formally recalling us. If you ignore that, I know exactly what it means, Ray. They will court-martial you. This isn't a maybe anymore. This is guaranteed. There is a man down there who has 10 minutes to live and I am 6 minutes away. I am not turning around, and I am not asking you to follow me into that, but I need you to make your own choice right now because we are out of time to debate this." The radio net went quiet except for the roar of engines, and far below the desperate crack of gunfire in a valley, two aircraft were now racing toward it full military power, defying a direct order, defying every rule written specifically to prevent exactly what they were about to do. Ethan stared down at his hands, still pressed against Coleman's leg, feeling the shallow, fluttering pulse under his fingertips, and realized he was holding his breath, waiting on a decision being made by a woman he had never met, 500 miles from anyone who could actually enforce the order she'd just been given. "Valkyrie," he said into the radio, voice hoarse, "you copy that recall order?" Her answer came back immediate, unwavering, final. "Copy the order, Phantom Team. Disregard. I'm still inbound. Hold on." Something broke loose in Ethan's chest at those words, something that felt dangerously close to hope, and he looked down at Coleman and squeezed the young man's hand. "You hear that, Danny? She's not turning back. She's coming for us." Coleman's lips moved, barely a whisper, but Ethan caught it. "Tell her thank you." Ethan keyed the radio one more time, throat tight. "Valkyrie, my man wants me to tell you thank you." There was a beat of silence, and when Olivia's voice came back, it had softened just slightly, just enough for the exhaustion and the fear underneath her professional calm to show through. "Tell him to hold on. I'm almost there." 4 minutes. In the cockpit, Olivia's hands were steady on the controls even as her mind raced through everything that decision was going to cost her. She had just disregarded a direct recall order in the middle of an active combat zone. There was no version of the coming weeks that didn't include an investigation, a hearing, possibly the end of everything she'd worked 9 years to build. She thought briefly painfully of her father, of that unopened letter sitting on her kitchen table, of every conversation they'd never quite finished about risk and duty, and what it meant to actually live by the things you said you believed in. She pushed the thought away. There wasn't room for it, not now. "Dawson, you still with me?" A pause, then quieter than before, but unmistakably resolute. "I'm with you. God help us both. I'm with you." "Copy that? Weapons check?" "Weapons hot. Cannon armed. Olivia, I need you to know if this goes bad, it's not going to go bad. But if it does, then it goes bad together. Now focus. We've got a valley coming up fast and 8 men down there who need us more than they need us arguing about it." Below them, the terrain began to change, mountains rising sharper, the narrow throat of a valley cutting between rock walls exactly where her navigation display said it would be. And even before she could see it clearly, she heard it, the faint, desperate crackle of gunfire bleeding through her radio from a fight that was still very much alive. "Phantom Team, Valkyrie 1, I have you visual in approximately 90 seconds. Confirm your position, marking. I need to know exactly where you are before I come in hot." Ethan's hand fumbled for a smoke canister, popped it, watched purple smoke begin curling up out of the rocks around his position, even as bullets cracked past close enough to feel. "Valkyrie, purple smoke. Purple smoke, that's us, that's our position. Copy purple smoke, I have it." Down in the valley, 3 minutes felt like 3 lifetimes. Coleman's breathing had gone shallower still, his skin gone the color of ash, and Harmon's hands, still pressed hard against the wound, had started to shake, not from fear, but from the sheer physical strain of holding pressure against an artery for what felt like forever. "Cap, I need you to know, if she doesn't get here in the next few minutes, I don't think—" "She's almost here, Doc. Just hold on. Just a little longer." The enemy fire intensified again. Another push from the north. Another RPG screaming in from the east that missed by inches and threw dirt and rock across the entire team. And for one horrible moment, Ethan thought this was it, thought the valley was finally about to close in completely before help could arrive. Then he heard it, a sound different from anything else in that valley. Not the crack of small arms, not the whistle of a rocket, a deep, distant rumble, low and powerful, growing louder with every second, rolling between the mountain walls like something ancient waking up. Sullivan's head snapped up, eyes wide. Cap, you hear that?" Ethan lifted his head, hard hammering, and stared toward the mouth of the valley where the sound was coming from, growing, building, impossibly close now. "Valkyrie, talk to me. Is that you? Is that—" "Phantom Team, This is Valkyrie 1. Her voice came through clear, steady, closer than it had ever been. I have your position. I am inbound hot. Get your heads down. This is about to get loud. Ethan grabbed the nearest man, Coleman still cradled against him, and shouted the only words that mattered in that entire valley. Everybody down! She's here! Get down now! And as the rumble grew into a roar that shook dust loose from the rocks around them, as every man in that valley pressed himself flat against the ground and prayed the same silent prayer, Ethan Walker looked up toward the ridgeline, just in time to see something break through the smoke and haze above them. Low, fast, and unmistakably real. The A-10 came out of the smoke like something out of a nightmare built specifically for the men who had ambushed Phantom Team, and for one suspended half-second, every gun on that ridgeline simply stopped firing, as if the enemy needed a moment to understand what they were looking at. Then the GAU-8 Avenger opened up. The sound didn't belong to this world. It wasn't a gunshot, wasn't even close to a gunshot. It was a single continuous roar that seemed to come from the mountain itself. And Ethan Walker, pressed flat against the rock with Coleman cradled against his chest, felt the ground actually shake beneath him. Holy! Sullivan's voice cracked over the net, disbelief and something close to joy tangled together. Cap, she's on them. She is directly on them. The North Ridge, the position that had pinned them for 15 brutal minutes, simply ceased to exist. Rock, dust, and whatever else had been up there disappeared into a boiling gray cloud, and when it cleared, there was no more muzzle fire coming from that direction. None. Northridge is down, Briggs shouted, his voice raw with disbelief. Cap, Northridge is silent. Ethan lifted his head just enough to see the A-10 bank hard, wings rocking, engine screaming as it climbed away from its first pass. He'd seen gun runs before. He'd called them in himself a dozen times over a dozen deployments. He had never, not once, seen anything land that fast, that close, that perfectly. Valkyrie, that was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful. We need more. East Ridge still has a rocket team. Copy, Phantom Team. I see them coming back around. In the cockpit, Olivia hauled the aircraft through a turn that pressed her hard into her seat, G-force dragging at her vision, and scanned the terrain below with an intensity that blocked out everything else in the world. No recall order. No investigation waiting for her back at base. No father, no unopened letter. Nothing except the men on the ground and the enemy position still trying to kill them. Dawson, I need you on the East Cliffs. Rocket team dug in near the base of the rock face. You see it? I see it, Olivia. Watch your six. They're going to track you through this turn. Copy. Going hot. She rolled in again, lower this time, low enough that Ethan swore later he could see rivets on the aircraft's wings, and the cannon opened up a second time, walking a line of destruction directly into the rocks where the rocket team had been dug in for the entire engagement. The explosion that followed wasn't hers, it was theirs, secondary ordnance cooking off in a fireball that told Ethan everything he needed to know. East Cliffs are down! Rocket team is gone, I say again. Rocket team is gone! 2 positions eliminated in under 90 seconds. Ethan felt something in his chest that he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the first shot rang out. Something dangerously close to hope. And he looked down at Coleman, whose eyes had drifted shut again. Coleman, stay with me. You hear the cannon? That's her. That's Valkyrie. She's tearing them apart up there. Coleman's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment Ethan's heart stopped completely, until a faint, weak whisper escaped his lips. Sounds beautiful. Doc, how's he doing? Talk to me. Harmon's face had gone grim in a way that scared Ethan more than any gunfire had all day. Pulse is weak, Cap. Real weak. The air support's buying us breathing room, but it's not fixing the bleed. He still needs a surgical team, and he needs it soon. The reminder hit Ethan like cold water. Yes, the immediate threat of being overrun had eased dramatically, miraculously, but Coleman's clock hadn't stopped just because the guns had gone quiet on 2 sides. It had just bought them time. Time that still might not be enough. Command, Phantom Team, be advised close air support is engaged and effective, requesting immediate medevac status. I still have a critical casualty. The response came back fast this time, the tone completely different from before, urgent now instead of bureaucratic. Phantom Team, be advised medevac has been launched. ETA 8 minutes to your position. 18 minutes. Better. Not good enough? Not with the window Harmon had given him, but better, and for the first time Ethan allowed himself to believe they might actually pull this off. Then the western wall, the side Sullivan had warned him about, the flanking route nobody had confirmed the numbers on, erupted with fire that told Ethan the enemy hadn't given up. They just repositioned. "West wall! They're pushing hard! West wall!" Sullivan's voice spiked with alarm as rounds cracked directly overhead. "Cap, this is a big element. This isn't 2 or 3 guys. I'm seeing at least 10, maybe more." Ethan's blood ran cold. 10 fighters, fresh, unengaged, pressing forward while his team was still pinned, still Senayana man, still fighting on adrenaline and fumes. "Valkyrie, we've got a new problem. West wall, large enemy element. Danger close, I say again. Danger close. There may be 40 meters from our position." There was a pause, and Ethan understood exactly what that pause meant. 40 meters was close. Too close for comfort on a strafing run, close enough that a miscalculation, a gust of wind, a half-second of error, could put 30-millimeter rounds directly on top of his own men instead of the enemy. "Copy danger close, Phantom Team. I need your exact position, marked clearly, right now. Purple smoke is still burning. We haven't moved. I see your smoke. I need everybody flat. Flat. Faces in the dirt. This is going to be close." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Everybody down. Faces in the dirt. Danger close inbound." He threw himself over Coleman's body, shielding the wounded man as best he could, and felt every muscle in his body clench as the roar of the A-10's engines grew louder, closer, terrifyingly close, until it felt like the aircraft was going to fly directly into the rock face above them. In the cockpit, Olivia's hands were absolutely steady, even as every instinct in her body screamed at the danger of what she was about to do. 40 meters, that was nothing. That was a margin so thin that any pilot with less experience, less nerve, would have called it off, requested the ground team pull back first, taken the safer option. There wasn't time for the safer option. "Dawson, I'm going in on the west wall. Danger close. Cover my run." "Olivia, 40 meters is insanely tight. If you're off by even a..." "I know exactly what 40 meters means, Ray. I'm not off." She rolled the aircraft into the dive, HUD locked on the target, breathing slow and controlled the way she'd trained herself to breathe under pressure since flight school, and squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared. 30-millimeter rounds torn to the western wall in a line so precise it looked almost surgical, walking directly along the enemy position and stopping exactly where it needed to stop. And when Ethan lifted his head from the dirt seconds later, ears ringing, dust raining down across his back, the western wall had gone silent. Not quiet, silent. "West wall is down," Cole said, voice hushed with something like awe. "Cap, west wall is completely down." For 3 full seconds, nobody in that valley said anything at all. The gunfire that had defined the last 20 minutes of their lives had simply stopped. All of it, north, east, west, gone, and the only sound left was the distant rumble of the A-10 climbing away for another pass, and the ragged, disbelieving breathing of 8 men who had genuinely believed 20 minutes ago that they weren't walking out of this valley. Then the south wall, the route Sullivan had never fully confirmed, opened up with a fresh burst of fire, and Ethan's stomach dropped all over again. "South wall, they're not done. South wall is active." Of course they weren't done. An enemy force large enough to build a 4-sided ambush like this one didn't simply give up because 3 of their positions had been erased in 90 seconds by an aircraft that wasn't even supposed to be here. Somewhere on that south wall, whoever was commanding this ambush was regrouping, consolidating, preparing to make this personal. "Valkyrie, south wall, we've got renewed contact south." "Copy, coming around." But this time when Olivia banked the aircraft back toward the valley, something new appeared on her threat display. A warning tone she recognized instantly and hated with everything in her. And her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the G-forces of the turn. "Dawson, I'm getting a SAM warning. Surface to air, south wall. They've got something bigger down there than rifles." Dawson's voice went sharp with alarm. "Olivia, break off. If they've got a man-pad down there, you cannot go back in on that heading. You're exposed the entire run." "There are still 8 men in that valley, Ray. And there's one of you. If you take a missile, you don't save anybody. You just become another casualty they have to explain." It was the single hardest calculation Olivia had made in her entire flying career. Harder even than the decision to divert in the first place because now the math had changed completely. It wasn't procedure against a man's life anymore. It was her life, quite possibly, against the completion of a rescue she had already sacrificed everything to begin. Below, Ethan's radio crackled with Command's voice, cutting back into the frequency with an urgency that hadn't been there before. Valkyrie 1, be advised, we are now tracking your transmissions. You are ordered to return to base immediately. This is a direct order from Group Command. Acknowledge. Ethan's blood ran cold hearing it, not because of what it meant for Olivia's career, though that mattered too, but because of what it meant for his team if she actually obeyed it. Valkyrie, negative, negative, we still have contact. We still need you. There was no answer. Just static and the distant sound of her engines circling somewhere above the smoke. And for 3 agonizing seconds, Ethan genuinely believed she was gone, that the order had finally reached her, that whatever had driven her to defy the first recall had run out somewhere over that south wall with a missile threat staring her down. Then her voice came back, and it was different this time. Rougher, more determined than anything he'd heard from her yet. Command, this is Valkyrie 1. I am declining that order. I have men in contact on the ground and a viable threat I can neutralize. I will answer for this when I land. Valkyrie 1, out. Olivia, Dawson started, but she cut him off before he could finish. Ray, I need you to trust me one more time. I'm going in low, fast, right under whatever they've got tracking me. I need you high, covering, and if I go down, I need you to mark my position and get out clean. That's an order, not a request. Olivia, say it back to me, Ray. A pause, heavy with everything neither of them wanted to say out loud. Copy, I mark your position, I get out clean. His voice cracked slightly. Don't you dare go down. I don't plan on it. She dropped the nose of the aircraft and dove. Down in the valley, Ethan watched the A-10 come screaming back in, lower than before, so low that for one terrifying moment, he thought she'd lost control, thought the aircraft was going to plow directly into the mountainside. Then he understood. She wasn't out of control. She was flying under the threat envelope, hugging the terrain so tightly that whatever weapon system was tracking her from the south wall couldn't get a clean lock. She's insane, Briggs breathed, watching the aircraft scream past close enough to feel the wind of its passage. She is absolutely insane. She's saving our lives. That's what she's doing, Ethan snapped back, though his heart was hammering just as hard watching the maneuver as it had been during any part of the firefight itself. The cannon opened up a third time and the south wall, along with whatever had been tracking Olivia's aircraft, disappeared into a cloud of smoke and debris. For a moment, everything went quiet, real quiet this time. No gunfire from any direction, no radio chatter except ragged breathing. Ethan looked around at his team, at Briggs still gripping his rifle with white knuckles, at Cole scanning the ridgelines out of pure reflex, even though there was nothing left to see, at Ortiz propped against a rock with his wounded leg bandaged and his weapon still up, and at Coleman, pale, barely conscious, but still breathing, still fighting. Is it over? Sullivan asked, voice barely above a whisper, like speaking too loud might undo whatever had just happened. I don't know, Ethan said honestly, but we've got a window. Doc, can we move him? Harmon's face was tight with concentration, hands still pressed against Coleman's leg. If we're careful, yeah, we need to move now while it's quiet. Get him to a spot the medevac can actually reach. Command, Phantom Team, we have a lull in contact requesting immediate medevac routing. I say again, immediate. Copy, Phantom Team. Medevac is 1-2 minutes out. Stand by for landing zone coordination. 12 minutes. Coleman's original window had been 10 to 12, and somehow impossibly, through blood and fire and a pilot who had broken every rule in the book to reach them, they had bought exactly enough time for that window to still be open. All right, listen up. Ethan's voice cut through the momentary calm with the authority that had kept this team alive for 3 years. We move to the landing zone. We move fast. We move together. Ortiz, can you walk? I can walk, Ortiz growled, already pushing himself up despite the bandage soaked through with blood. Try and stop me. Briggs, Cole, you're on security. Watch our flanks. We are not getting caught flat-footed again. Sully, help Doc with Coleman. They moved as one unit, the way 3 years of training and combat had welded them together. Coleman carried carefully between Harmon and Sullivan, Ortiz limping but upright, weapons still ready. Briggs and Cole sweeping the terrain on either side with the wary, practiced eyes of men who had just learned exactly how badly things could still go wrong even after the worst seemed over. They'd made it maybe 60 meters when Coleman's breathing changed. "Doc!" Sullivan's voice went tight with alarm. "Doc, something's wrong. He's not breathing right." Harmon dropped to his knees immediately, fingers at Coleman's throat, and his face, already grim, went pale in a way that made Ethan's heart stop cold. "Pulse is thready, breathing's shallow, Cap. He's crashing. He's crashing right now. What do you need?" "I need that medevac right now. That's what I need. I've got nothing left. I've done everything I can do out here." Ethan grabbed the radio, hands shaking for the first time all day. "Command, Phantom Team, my casualty is crashing. I need that medevac now. How far out? How far?" "Phantom Team, medevac is 8 minutes out, currently inbound." 8 minutes. Harmon's hands were pressed hard against Coleman's chest now, counting, adjusting, doing everything a combat medic could possibly do with the limited tools strapped to his back, and Ethan knelt beside his teammate, gripping the young man's hand with a desperation he hadn't let himself feel even during the worst of the firefight. Coleman, don't you dare. Don't you dare do this now. Not after everything. Not after she got here. Not after all of this. You hear me? You fight." Coleman's eyes cracked open, unfocused, distant. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "What? What is it? Say it again." A whisper, barely audible. "Tell her, thank you." "You're going to tell her yourself, damn it, you hear me? Stay with me." Above them, circling protectively even though the immediate threat had been neutralized, Olivia's voice crackled over the radio, tight with concern of her own. "Phantom Team, I see movement. Is everything all right down there? Talk to me." Ethan keyed the radio, voice breaking despite every effort to keep it steady. "Valkyrie, my man is crashing. I need that medevac faster than 8 minutes. I need something." There was a beat of silence, and then Olivia's voice came back, and there was something in it, some fierce determination, that told Ethan she wasn't done fighting for his team yet. "Copy that, Phantom Team. I'm marking your exact position and relaying priority medevac status directly. Hold on, I'm not leaving this airspace until that bird has your man." She banked the aircraft into a tight orbit directly above their position, close enough that Ethan could hear the engines the entire time, a constant, reassuring presence circling overhead like a guardian that refused to leave. "Command, this is Valkyrie 1. I need that medevac's exact ET. A updated now. I have a casualty actively crashing on the ground. This is priority 1. Do you copy?" "Valkyrie 1, be advised, that's not your net to be transmitting priority medevac status. I don't care whose net it is. There's a man dying down there, and I need that bird moving faster. Now escalate this, or put me through to someone who can." Something in her voice, some absolute refusal to back down even now, even after everything, must have gotten through because 30 seconds later the update came back, and it was better. "Phantom Team, medevac ETA revised 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Harmon's hands never stopped moving, compressions and pressure and whispered encouragement that Ethan suspected was as much for himself as for Coleman. "Come on, kid. Come on, stay with me. 4 minutes, you hear that? 4 minutes." Ethan looked up at the sky, at the A-10 circling low and tight above them, refusing to leave, refusing to abandon them even now that the shooting had stopped, and felt something in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Gratitude maybe, or something bigger than gratitude, something closer to awe at the sheer, stubborn will of a stranger who had thrown away everything to make sure his team came home. The sound of new rotors cut through the air before Ethan even fully registered it. Distant at first, then closer, then unmistakable. The heavy, familiar thump of a medevac helicopter inbound. "That's them! That's the medevac, Cap! I see them!" Sullivan pointed toward the horizon where a shape had appeared. Low and fast, painted with the red cross that meant salvation of men who had spent their entire careers hoping never to need it. "Get that smoke popped, mark the LZ, move." Briggs had another canister out and burning in seconds, and the helicopter banked toward the purple smoke rising up from the valley floor, flaring hard as it came into land. Rotor wash kicking up a storm of dust and rock that stung Ethan's eyes even as he shielded Coleman's body with his own. The moment the wheels touched down, flight medics were out and moving, and Harmon was shouting handoff information over the noise of the rotors, femoral bleed, pressure applied for 18 minutes, vitals crashing in the last 90 seconds, and the medics moved with the kind of practiced urgency that told Ethan they understood exactly how narrow this window had become. They loaded Coleman aboard, and for one terrible moment, as the helicopter's engines spun up to full power, Ethan lost sight of him completely in the swirl of dust and motion. "Cap!" Harmon grabbed his arm, shouting over the noise. "Cap, we need to load the rest of the wounded. Come on!" Ortiz was helped aboard next, still cursing about his leg, still somehow managing to sound more annoyed than afraid, and Ethan stood at the edge of the landing zone, doing a final head count that he would remember for the rest of his life. 8 men had walked into that valley. 8 men were being accounted for right now. Wounded, exhausted, filthy with dust and blood, but breathing. All of them breathing. As the medevac lifted off, carrying Coleman and Ortiz toward the surgical team that could actually save what an A-10 pilot and a stubborn combat medic had managed to keep alive, against every possible odd, Ethan looked up one final time toward the aircraft still circling protectively overhead. "Valkyrie, this is Phantom Team Actual. Medevac is away, wounded are aboard. We are..." His voice caught, thick with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel until this exact second. "We are all still here. Because of you." There was a pause, and when Olivia's voice came back, it had lost every trace of the fierce, unshakable command it had carried through the entire engagement, replaced instead by something quieter, more human, almost fragile with relief. "Copy that, Phantom Team. I'm glad. I'm..." A breath, audible even over the radio. "I'm really glad. What's your name? Your actual name, not your call sign. I want to know who saved my team." Another pause, longer this time, and Ethan could almost picture her hesitating, weighing whether that information even mattered anymore, given everything that was about to happen once she landed. "Carter," she said finally. "Captain Olivia Carter. Captain Walker. Ethan Walker. I owe you a debt I don't think I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything, Captain. You just needed someone to show up." Her voice tightened slightly. "I've got to break off now. Get your team clear of this area. There could still be stragglers." "Copy that. Carter." He hesitated, searching for words big enough for what he actually wanted to say and finding none of them adequate. "Thank you. Whatever happens next, on your end, thank you." She didn't answer right away, and when she finally did, there was something in her voice that Ethan would only fully understand weeks later, once he learned exactly what whatever happens next was going to mean for the woman who had just saved his entire team. "Just get your men home safe, Captain. That's all the thanks I need." The A-10 banked away from the valley, climbing hard toward the horizon, and Ethan watched it go until it disappeared from sight, already knowing somewhere deep in his gut that this wasn't the end of the story. Not for her, not by a long shot. Because 500 miles away, back at a base where a recall order had been issued and ignored, where an unauthorized diversion had already been logged, flagged, and forwarded up a chain of command that did not tolerate pilots who decided the rules didn't apply to them, someone was already pulling Olivia Carter's flight records and preparing questions that no amount of saved lives was going to make disappear entirely. The wheels of Olivia's A-10 touched down on the runway with a jolt that felt, to her, nothing like the hundreds of landings that had come before it. Every previous landing had been an ending. This one felt like the start of something she couldn't see the shape of yet, and her hands were shaking slightly as she taxied toward the flight line, adrenaline finally draining out of her body and leaving something colder behind in its place. Dawson's aircraft rolled in beside hers, and by the time she'd popped her canopy and started climbing down, he was already standing on the tarmac waiting for her, his flight helmet under one arm, his face unreadable in a way that worried her more than if he'd looked angry. "Ray, don't," he said quietly, before she could say anything else. "Don't apologize. Don't explain. Not yet. Just walk with me." They hadn't made it 50 feet across the flight line before a truck pulled up fast, and 2 officers Olivia didn't recognize stepped out, their expressions carrying the particular blankness of men who had been sent to deliver news they didn't personally want to deliver. "Captain Carter?" "Yes, sir." "You're to report to the wing commander's office immediately. Both of you." His eyes flicked to Dawson. "Now, Captain. Not after debrief. Now." Olivia felt her stomach drop, though she'd known this was coming from the moment she'd disregarded that second recall order somewhere over the south wall of that valley. Knowing it was coming and actually standing in front of it were two very different things. Copy that, sir. The walk to the wing commander's office felt longer than the flight itself. Olivia kept her spine straight, her steps even, refusing to let the fear show on her face the same way she'd refused to let it show in the cockpit. But underneath the calm exterior, her mind was racing through every possible outcome. None of them good. Colonel Harrison Vance was already standing when they entered his office, not sitting behind his desk the way commanders usually did for routine conversations, but standing, arms crossed, positioned like a man who had spent the last 40 minutes working himself into exactly the kind of controlled fury that made subordinates' careers disappear. Sit, he said, and it wasn't a request. They sat. Captain Carter. He let her name hang in the air for a long moment, and Olivia forced herself to meet his eyes without flinching. You want to explain to me what the hell happened today? Sir, I received a bleed-over transmission indicating a friendly unit in heavy contact with a critical casualty. I assessed my position relative to task support assets and determined I could reach them significantly faster. I made the decision to divert and provide close air support. You made the decision. Vance's voice was flat, dangerous. You are aware, Captain, that decision was not yours to make. Yes, sir, I'm aware. You received a direct order to maintain your flight plan. You disregarded it. You received a second direct recalls order once your transmissions were identified. You disregarded that one too. He leaned forward slightly, and Olivia could see the muscle working in his jaw. Do you have any idea what you've exposed this command to? Unauthorized use of live ordnance in a combat zone without proper clearance. Direct disobedience of lawful orders, not once but twice. You put 2 aircraft and 2 pilots into an engagement with unknown enemy capabilities, no coordination with ground forces beyond a single radio contact, and a documented surface-to-air threat that you flew directly underneath. Every word landed exactly where it was meant to land, and Olivia felt each one, but she kept her chin level. Sir, with respect, there was a Navy SEAL bleeding out on the ground with a survival window under 10 minutes. The tasked asset was 23 minutes out at the time I made contact. I calculated I could reach them in 6. That is not your calculation to make. Vance's voice cracked across the room like a whip, and for a moment even Dawson flinched beside her. You are not a rescue coordinator, Captain. You are a pilot on a training sortie, and there is an entire chain of command specifically designed to make exactly the kind of calculation you decided to make unilaterally from a cockpit with none of the situational awareness that command actually had. Then command was wrong, Olivia said quietly, and the room went absolutely still. Vance stared at her for a long moment, and Olivia understood, distantly, that she had just said something that could not be unsaid, that whatever chance she'd had at a measured procedural outcome to this conversation had probably just evaporated. Excuse me? Sir, I don't say that with disrespect. I say it because it's true. Whatever the reasoning was, the timeline command gave that ground team would have resulted in a dead American operator. I heard his medic say it myself over an open channel, in real time, 10 to 12 minutes. That's what he had. Command's asset was 25 minutes out when I first made contact. And even after I diverted, it never got under 18. If I hadn't gone in, sir, Danny Coleman does not survive today. I understand the regulations I broke. I understood them in the cockpit, in real time while I was breaking them, and I would make the same decision again. Dawson's head turned toward her, sharp, something between alarm and disbelieving admiration crossing his face. Vance said nothing for what felt like a full minute, just stood there, arms still crossed, jaw working, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter and somehow more frightening than the shouting had been. You understand that statement alone is grounds for immediate suspension of your flight status, pending a full investigation. Yes, sir. You understand this could end your career. Yes, sir. I understood that before I turned the aircraft. Something flickered across Vance's face then. Something that might have been respect buried underneath the fury, though it was gone too fast for Olivia to be certain she hadn't imagined it. Both of you are grounded, effective immediately, pending review. Your flight status is suspended. You will not fly, you will not access flight operations areas, and you will make yourselves available for formal statements starting tomorrow at 0800. Is that understood? Understood, sir, Olivia said. Understood, sir, Dawson echoed, his voice tighter than she'd ever heard it. Dismissed, both of you. They walked out of that office in silence, And it wasn't until they were well clear of the building, standing in the fading evening light, with the sound of aircraft still running somewhere on the flight line, that Dawson finally spoke. "You told him you'd do it again." "I would." "Olivia, do you understand what you just did in there? You could have hedged. You could have said you made a split-second judgment call under pressure, that you regretted the method even if the outcome was good, and half the review board would have gone easy on you for showing remorse. Instead, you told the wing commander to his face that command was wrong, because they were." Her voice cracked slightly, the first real crack in her composure since she'd landed, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for a moment. Exhaustion and adrenaline crash finally catching up to her all at once. "Ray, I heard that man's voice. I heard him counting down his own teammate's life over an open channel. I'm not going to stand in an office and pretend I don't know what I know just to save my own skin." Dawson studied her for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he put a hand on her shoulder. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'd fly behind you into that valley again tomorrow. Whatever happens with this investigation, I need you to know that." Olivia felt something tighten in her throat, and she nodded, not trusting her voice to hold steady if she tried to answer. The investigation that followed moved faster than either of them expected, and worse than either of them hoped. Within 48 hours, Olivia had been formally notified that a flight evaluation board would convene to review the incident, an administrative process one step short of a court-martial, but serious enough that everyone around her, from junior maintenance crew to fellow pilots, had started treating her with the careful, slightly distant politeness reserved for people whose careers were visibly hanging by a thread. She spent those 2 days grounded, restricted to quarters in the base exchange, cut off from the only thing that had ever made sense to her, flying. And it was during the long, empty hours of the second day that she finally opened the letter from her father. It had been sitting on her kitchen table for 3 weeks, and she told herself a dozen different reasons for not opening it. Too busy, too tired. Nothing in it was going to be good news anyway, given how things had been between them since she'd chosen the Air Force over the family construction business he'd built from nothing. But grounded, alone, facing the possible end of the only career she'd ever wanted, she finally tore it open. It wasn't what she expected. Her father had written about regret, about the years he'd spent disapproving of her choice instead of understanding it, about watching the news one night and seeing coverage of a rescue operation that reminded him, painfully, of every argument they'd had about risk and duty and what a person owed to the people around them. He wrote that he was proud of her, that he should have said it years ago, that he hoped she knew it even though he'd never found the courage to say the words out loud. Olivia sat with that letter for a long time, tears she hadn't let herself shed since the moment she'd landed, finally falling freely, and for the first time since the wing commander's office, she let herself feel the full weight of everything she might be about to lose. 500 miles away in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and fear, Ethan Walker sat beside a bed where Danny Coleman lay pale but breathing, chest rising and falling in the slow, steady rhythm of a man who had come impossibly close to not breathing at all. "They said the surgery went well," Ethan said, more to fill the silence than because Coleman, still heavily sedated, could actually hear him. "Repaired the artery. Doc says you'll walk again fine, might even run, given enough time and some truly excessive physical therapy that I fully intend to make fun of you for." Coleman's eyelids fluttered, not quite waking, but close enough that Ethan leaned forward, gripping the young man's hand. Hey, you in there?" A faint, groggy murmur. "Cap? Yeah, it's me. You're okay, Danny, you made it." Coleman's eyes cracked open, unfocused at first, then slowly finding Ethan's face. "The pilot," he mumbled, voice thick with sedation. Is she okay?" The question hit Ethan harder than he expected, because he'd been asking himself some version of it every single hour since he'd watched that A-10 bank away from the valley and disappear into the horizon. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." He kept that promise 3 days later, the moment military protocol allowed him to travel, boarding a flight that took him 500 miles from his own recovering team to a base he'd never set foot on, walking into a building he had no official reason to enter, and requesting, with the particular stubbornness of a man who owed someone a debt he refused to let go unpaid, a meeting with whoever was overseeing the review of Captain Olivia Carter's conduct. He didn't get the meeting easily. The administrative officer at the front desk looked at him like he'd requested something faintly ridiculous. A Navy SEAL commander showing up unannounced at an Air Force base to advocate for a pilot in the middle of a disciplinary review. And it took almost 2 hours of waiting, explaining, and eventually invoking the name of his own commanding officer before anyone with actual authority agreed to see him. That authority turned out to be Colonel Vance himself, who met Ethan in a conference room with an expression that suggested he'd already heard exactly why this SEAL commander had traveled 500 miles uninvited, and wasn't entirely sure whether to be irritated or curious about it. "Captain Walker, I'll admit this is unusual." "I imagine it is, sir. I appreciate you seeing me. You understand I can't discuss the specifics of an ongoing personnel review with someone outside the chain of command." "I understand that, sir. I'm not here to discuss specifics. I'm here because I was told there's a formal review board convening regarding Captain Carter's decision to divert to my team's position, and I wanted to make sure that whoever sits on that board hears directly from the man whose team she saved exactly what happened in that valley. Not the summary, not the flight logs, what actually happened." Vance studied him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "The board convenes in 2 days. I can't promise you a seat at the table, Captain. That's not how these proceedings work, but I can pass along a written statement if you're willing to provide one." "With respect, sir, a written statement isn't going to carry the same weight as looking the board in the eye and telling them what I watched that woman do." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but carrying an intensity that filled the room. "Sir, I've led men into combat for 12 years. I've called for air support more times than I can count, and 90% of the time, it works exactly the way it's supposed to, professional, by the book, and by the time it arrives, the crisis has usually already been decided one way or another. This wasn't that. My team was surrounded on 4 sides. We had a man bleeding out with a window under 10 minutes, and the tasked asset was 25 minutes out. 25 minutes against 10. That's not a margin, sir. That's a death sentence, and everybody on that radio net knew it. I'm aware of the timeline, Captain." "Then you're aware that if Captain Carter had followed procedure, if she'd stayed on her assigned flight plan the way she was ordered to, twice, Danny Coleman is dead." "Not maybe, not probably. He had 10 to 12 minutes, and the only asset that could reach him in that window was a training aircraft flown by a pilot who wasn't tasked to my mission and had no obligation whatsoever to risk her career or her life for 8 men she'd never met." Vance was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan pressed on, because he hadn't traveled 500 miles to leave anything unsaid. "I understand rules exist for good reasons, sir. I've built my entire career respecting the chain of command, respecting procedure, because most of the time, that structure is exactly what keeps people alive. But sometimes the structure moves too slow for the moment it's supposed to serve. And when that happens, somebody has to make a choice that the manual never anticipated. Captain Carter made that choice. She flew into a valley she had no orders to enter, took fire on a run she didn't have to fly, and stayed circling overhead even after the shooting stopped because she refused to leave until she knew my men were actually safe. If that's the kind of officer your Air Force is prepared to discharge over a procedural violation, sir, I'd respectfully suggest you're about to lose exactly the kind of person this country needs most." The room fell silent, and Vance sat back in his chair, arms still crossed, expression unreadable. Though something in his posture had shifted subtly during Ethan's statement, some of the rigid fury from that first evening replaced by something more contemplative. "You feel strongly about this?" "I owe her, sir. Every man on my team owes her. That's not something I take lightly." Vance was quiet for a long moment, studying Ethan with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Off the record, Captain Walker, between us, I've read every line of that flight recording. I've listened to the radio transmissions from your side of this engagement and hers. I know exactly what Captain Carter did today, and I know exactly why she did it." He paused, something heavy in his voice. "I also know that if I let this go unaddressed, if there's no consequence at all for 2 pilots disregarding direct orders, twice in an active combat zone, I set a precedent that could get somebody killed the next time a pilot decides their own judgment overrides commands. That's the tension I'm sitting with, Captain. It's not as simple as heroes and villains." I understand that, sir. I'm not asking you to pretend rules don't matter. I'm asking you to remember that 8 men are alive today who wouldn't be, and that the woman responsible for that deserves to have her whole story heard, not just the parts that fit neatly into a violation report. Vance nodded slowly, and for the first time since Ethan had walked into that room, something like genuine respect crossed his face. I'll make sure the board hears it, Captain. I can't promise you the outcome, but I'll make sure they hear it. 2 days later, the review board convened in a room that felt, to Olivia, colder than any cockpit she'd ever flown in. 5 officers sat behind a long table, folders open in front of them, and Colonel Vance sat at the center, his expression carefully neutral in a way that gave her absolutely nothing to read. Captain Carter, the senior board member, a 2-star general Olivia had only ever seen from a distance, opened the proceeding with a voice that carried the flat, procedural weight of 100 similar hearings before it. We've reviewed the flight recordings, the radio transmissions, and the incident report filed by Colonel Vance. Before we proceed to questions, is there anything you'd like to state for the record? Olivia's hands were folded tightly in her lap, and she made herself sit up straight, made herself meet the eyes of every officer at that table, one at a time, before she spoke. Only that I understand the seriousness of what I did, and I'm not here to argue that the rules I broke don't matter. They do. I disregarded a direct order to maintain my flight plan. I disregarded a second direct order to return to base. I used live ordnance in a combat zone I was not tasked to support. Every one of those actions is a serious violation, and I accept full responsibility for each of them. Yeah. The general's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly having expected something closer to a defense. However, Olivia continued, voice steadying with each word, I also want the board to understand that I made those decisions with full awareness of the consequences. In real time, while a man's life was ending in front of people who had no way to save him without help arriving faster than procedure allowed. I heard his medic on an open channel counting down a survival window that the tasked asset could not meet. I calculated that I could. I was right. Danny Coleman is alive today in a hospital bed because the math worked out in his favor by exactly the margin I created by breaking those rules. If the board determines that decision ends my career, I'll accept that outcome. But I won't sit here and tell you I regret making it, because I don't. Given the exact same information, in the exact same moment, I would make the exact same choice again. The room was silent for a long moment after she finished, and Olivia forced herself not to look away, not to soften, not to give them the easier, more repentant version of herself that might have played better for the board, but wouldn't have been true. Then, unexpectedly, the general spoke again, his voice carrying something different now, something less procedural. Captain Walker traveled here 2 days ago to speak on your behalf. Colonel Vance has provided the board with a full account of that conversation. He glanced down at the folder in front of him. He described watching you fly a danger-close gun run 40 meters from his position under a surface-to-air threat, and then circle that valley for nearly 10 additional minutes after the engagement ended, coordinating priority medevac status for his critically wounded operator, despite having already received a direct order to return to base. Olivia hadn't known that, hadn't known Ethan had come, hadn't known any of it, and she felt something crack open in her chest, gratitude so sudden and overwhelming it nearly stole her voice. He said, and I'm reading this directly from the transcript of our conversation, that if the United States Air Force is prepared to discharge the kind of officer who makes that decision, this country is about to lose exactly the people it needs most. The general closed the folder slowly. The board will deliberate and issue findings within 72 hours, Captain Carter. That's all for today. Olivia stood, saluted, and walked out of that room with her legs shaking beneath her, uncertain whether what she just witnessed was the sound of her career being saved or simply the sound of it ending with slightly more ceremony than she'd expected. She didn't have to wait the full 72 hours to find out. Late that evening, as she sat alone in her quarters staring at her father's letter for the dozenth time, there was a knock at her door, and when she opened it, she found Colonel Vance standing there, out of uniform for once, looking less like a commander delivering a verdict and more like a man who had come to have a conversation. Sir, she stood a little straighter out of habit. I wasn't expecting... I know, this isn't official, Captain, so you can relax. He glanced past her into the small, sparse room, then back at her face. I wanted to tell you something myself before the formal notification comes through tomorrow. Olivia's stomach clenched. Sir? Vance was quiet for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of the sharp fury from that first evening in his office. The board's decision is disciplinary action and a temporary suspension of flight status. 30 days pending review of procedures with your squadron. Formal reprimand in your file. He paused, watching her carefully. You keep your wings, Captain. Once the suspension lifts, you fly again. Olivia's knees nearly buckled with relief, and she pressed a hand against the doorframe to steady herself, unable to speak for a long moment. I don't know what to say, sir. Don't say anything, just understand this. Vance's expression grew serious. What you did was reckless by every regulation this Air Force has ever written. I want to be very clear that I am not telling you it was the right call in some general sense. Because if every pilot started making unilateral combat decisions based on their own read of a situation, we would lose people, good people, to exactly the kind of overconfidence that gets units killed instead of saved. He paused. But I've spent 30 years in this uniform, Captain, and I've learned that sometimes the exception proves why the rule exists in the first place. You were right this time because the math actually was on your side, because your judgment happened to be sound, because you got there in time and you didn't hit a single friendly position in the process. That's not luck, entirely. That's skill. But it's also not something I can build a policy around, and it's not something I want you or any other pilot in my command treating as a blueprint for how things should normally work. I understand, sir. I don't think you fully do. Not yet. But you will. For now, he extended a hand and Olivia shook it, still slightly stunned. Congratulations, Captain Carter. Get some rest. You've earned it. He turned to leave and Olivia, still processing everything, called after him. Sir, why? Why did the board decide the way they did? Vance paused in the doorway, considering the question longer than Olivia expected. Because a Navy SEAL commander flew 500 miles to remind us that regulations exist to save lives, not end them, and that somewhere in the gap between the two, a pilot made a decision that saved 8 of them. He glanced back at her. That's a hard thing for a review board to argue with, Captain, no matter how many rules got broken along the way. He left, and Olivia stood alone in her doorway for a long time afterward, staring out at the darkening sky where, somewhere far beyond the horizon, a runway was waiting for the day her wings would carry her back into it. 3 weeks later, Ethan Walker walked through the doors of a military hospital he'd already visited more times than he could count, carrying a small paper bag that smelled like the one thing Danny Coleman had complained about missing more than anything else since he'd woken up from surgery. Please tell me that's what I think it is, Coleman said from his hospital bed, struggling to sit up against the pillows, color back in his face now. The ashen gray from that valley replaced with something closer to his old self, though the exhaustion of recovery still hung around his eyes. Your mother's recipe, called her myself, made her walk me through it over the phone twice because apparently I'm hopeless in a kitchen. Ethan set the bag down on the bedside tray. She sends her love, and a threat that, if you don't eat all of it, she's flying out here personally. That tracks. Coleman managed a weak laugh, then winced, one hand going to his side. Don't make me laugh, Cap. It still pulls. Sorry, not sorry. Ethan settled into the chair beside the bed, the same chair he'd been sitting in nearly every day since the surgery, watching a kid he'd recruited 3 years ago slowly claw his way back from a wound that should have killed him in that valley. The doctors had been careful with their language at first, cautiously optimistic, the kind of phrase that meant they weren't promising anything. But with each passing week, the caution had softened into something closer to certainty. Coleman would walk again. He'd probably even run, eventually, though the physical therapist had made it very clear that eventually meant months, not weeks, and that impatience would be Coleman's biggest enemy from here on out. How's the leg today? Ugly. Doc says the muscle's healing faster than expected, though, so... Coleman shrugged, then immediately regretted the motion, hissing through his teeth. Whatever expected means to a guy who's never actually had his femoral artery torn open. Could have done without the visual, but I appreciate the update. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that had settled between them over the weeks, born out of shared trauma and the strange, unbreakable intimacy that comes from one man kneeling in the dirt with his hands pressed against another man's dying wound. Then Coleman's expression shifted, something more serious crossing his face. Cap, I keep thinking about her. Ethan didn't need to ask who he meant. Carter. Yeah. Coleman picked at the edge of his blanket, suddenly looking younger than his 26 years. I was barely conscious most of it, but I remember hearing that cannon. I remember thinking, whoever that is, they came for us. And then I remember you telling me she wasn't turning back, even after they ordered her to. He looked up. Is she okay? Really okay. Last I heard there was some kind of investigation. Ethan smiled, a real smile, one that had been building in him for days now, ever since the phone call he'd received 2 nights earlier. She's okay, board finished their review. 30-day suspension, formal reprimand in her file, but she keeps her wings. He watched relief flood across Coleman's face. She's back flying next week, actually. You talked to her? I've talked to her a few times now, yeah. Ethan hesitated, then reached for his phone. In fact, she wanted me to give you something, when you were strong enough. Said it wasn't urgent, that it could wait as long as it needed to. But I figured, given how much you keep asking about her, maybe it's time. He turned the phone around, screen lit with a video message, and pressed play. Olivia Carter's face filled the small screen, still in flight suit, hair pulled back, looking exactly as steady and composed as she had sounded over that radio net weeks earlier. Except now there was no gunfire in the background, no danger pressing in from every direction. Just a quiet room and a woman who had clearly rehearsed what she wanted to say and still seemed nervous saying it. Danny, hi. Captain Walker tells me you're doing better, which honestly is the best news I've gotten in weeks. She paused and something vulnerable crossed her face, a crack in the composure that hadn't been there in any of her radio transmissions. I've thought about you every single day since that valley. I didn't know your name until Captain Walker told me, weeks later, and it felt strange, honestly, to have flown into the middle of the worst day of your life and not even know who I was fighting for. But I want you to know something. That entire flight, every second of it, I wasn't thinking about regulations or consequences or what might happen to me afterward. I was thinking about getting to you in time, about a mother somewhere who didn't know yet how close she'd come to losing her son. I'm just glad, more than I can properly say, that she never had to find out. A small, watery laugh escaped her. Get better, Danny. Fly right or, well, walk right, I suppose, in your case. And know that you've got a friend in the Air Force, whether you asked for one or not. The video ended, and Coleman sat completely still for a long moment, eyes glassy, throat working. She didn't even know my name, he finally said, voice thick. She flew into that valley, took fire, ignored a direct order, twice, and she didn't even know who she was risking her life for. That's exactly the point, Danny. She didn't need to know your name to know you mattered. Coleman wiped roughly at his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed, and Ethan pretended not to notice, giving him the small mercy of looking away for a moment while he composed himself. I want to meet her, Coleman said finally, when I'm out of here, when I can actually stand up and shake her hand instead of doing it from a hospital bed hooked up to an IV. I already told her you would say that. She said she's counting on it. 2 months later, that meeting finally happened. Not in a hospital, not on a base, but at a small gathering organized quietly, without press, without ceremony. Exactly the way both Ethan and Olivia had insisted it needed to be. Just the people who mattered, in a backyard, under an ordinary sky, sharing food and stories the way people do when they've survived something together and finally have the distance to talk about it without their hands shaking. Coleman stood on his own 2 feet when Olivia arrived, leaning slightly on a cane he'd need for a few more months, but standing, upright, alive. And the moment she stepped through the gate and their eyes met across the yard, something passed between them that didn't need words. He crossed the distance slower than he used to move, the cane tapping against the ground with each step, and when he finally reached her, he didn't say anything at all. He just pulled her into a hug, tight, grateful, the kind of embrace that carries an entire unspoken conversation inside it. Thank you, he finally managed, voice muffled against her shoulder, for not knowing my name and coming anyway. Olivia held on just as tight, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet. Thank you for being worth coming for. Ortiz was there too, walking without the limp that had marked those first few weeks after the valley, and he shook Olivia's hand with the kind of firm, grateful grip that said more than any speech could have. Briggs, Cole, Sullivan, Harmon, every man from that valley stood in that backyard, whole, breathing, alive because of a decision made in 6 impossible minutes by a pilot who'd never met any of them. Harmon was the one who finally said what everyone had been thinking all afternoon, raising a glass with a hand that had once been slick with Coleman's blood, now steady, now simply grateful. "To Captain Olivia Carter," he said, voice rough with emotion he didn't bother hiding, who heard 8 strangers on a radio and decided that mattered more than her own career. "To Valkyrie," Sullivan added, and the whole yard raised their glasses. Olivia stood in the middle of that circle of men she'd saved, overwhelmed, and Ethan watched her from across the yard with a quiet satisfaction that had been building in him for months now. Ever since that valley, ever since he'd first understood exactly what her decision had cost her, and exactly what it had given back to the world. Later, after most of the guests had gone, after the sun had started sinking low and the backyard had grown quiet, Ethan found Olivia sitting alone near the edge of the gathering. Watching Coleman across the yard, laughing at something Ortiz had said, cane propped against his chair, looking for all the world like a man who had never come within minutes of not existing. "Penny for your thoughts," Ethan said, settling into the chair beside her. Olivia was quiet for a moment, watching Coleman laugh. "I keep thinking about how close it was. Not just his life, the whole thing. If I hadn't caught that bleed-over transmission, if Dawson had talked me out of it, if Command's second recall had actually reached me before I got there." She shook her head slowly. There were about a dozen different moments where this could have gone completely differently. But it didn't. No, it didn't. She turned to look at him. "Can I ask you something, Captain?" "Ethan, and yeah, ask away." "Ethan." She tested the name, then continued. "Why did you come to that hearing? You didn't have to. You could have sent a written statement, let the process play out however it was going to play out. Instead, you flew 500 miles to argue on behalf of a pilot you'd known for less than 20 minutes, entirely over a radio." Ethan considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, turning it over before answering. "Because I watched you do something that day that most people spend their entire lives claiming they do and never actually get tested on. You had every reason in the world to stay on your flight plan. Nobody would have blamed you. Nobody would have even known you'd hurt us if you just let that transmission fade back into static and kept flying your training route." He paused. "But you didn't. You heard 8 strangers dying in a valley you had no obligation to, and you decided their lives mattered more than your career, more than the rules, more than your own safety. That's not something people do because they're following orders, Olivia. That's something people do because of who they actually are, underneath all the training and procedure and regulation. I wasn't going to let a review board erase that just because it happened to be inconvenient for the paperwork." Olivia was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone soft, almost fragile. "You know what the strangest part is? I almost didn't. There was a solid 10 seconds where I almost let Dawson talk me out of it, where the fear of what it might cost me almost won." She looked down at her hands. "I think about that a lot, how close I came to being the version of myself that just followed the rules and let the math run out the way it was supposed to run out. But you didn't." "No." A small, genuine smile crossed her face. "I didn't." Across the yard, Coleman caught sight of them talking and waved them over, and Olivia and Ethan rose together, walking back toward the group, back toward the sound of laughter and stories and the particular kind of joy that only exists among people who have survived something together and come out the other side. The months that followed brought their own kind of quiet vindication. Coleman finished physical therapy ahead of schedule, stubborn and determined in exactly the way Ethan had always known him to be, and returned to limited duty status with a scar on his leg that he'd started calling his lucky mark, a story he told with more pride than pain whenever anyone asked about it. Ortiz healed clean, back to full operational status within 4 months, still cursing about the whole experience with the particular colorful vocabulary that made every retelling of that valley firefight somehow both harrowing and hilarious, depending on which parts he chose to emphasize. Olivia's 30-day suspension ended, and she climbed back into the cockpit of an A-10 for the first time since that valley, hands steady, heart pounding with something that felt less like fear and more like homecoming. Dawson flew beside her again, wingman as always, and their first flight back together was, true to his word, boring. Boring, exactly the kind of routine, uneventful sortie he'd always claimed to prefer. "See," he said over the radio halfway through the flight, "boring, just like I like it." Don't jinx it, Olivia said, and this time when she said it, there was a smile in her voice that hadn't been there the first time. But it was what happened 6 months later that Ethan would remember as the true resolution of everything that had started in that valley. The moment that proved the whole story wasn't really about rules broken or investigations survived, but about something far simpler and far more important than any of that. He'd flown out to Olivia's base for an unrelated training exercise, one of those routine inter-service coordination events that brought different branches together for a few days of joint planning. And he found her in the squadron ready room going over flight plans with a focus that told him some things about her hadn't changed at all and never would. Captain Walker. She looked up, genuine warmth in her expression now. None of the careful formality from those first radio transmissions all those months ago. What brings you to my neck of the woods? Joint training exercise. Figured I'd stop by, see how Valkyrie's doing these days. Valkyrie's doing just fine. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Actually, there's something I wanted to tell you, something that happened last week. Yeah? I got called into Colonel Vance's office again. She smiled at his immediate look of alarm. Relax, it's good news this time. Command's putting together a formal review of close air support response protocols, specifically looking at situations involving critical casualties and extended response windows. They're using our engagement, the whole thing, the radio transmissions, the timeline, the outcome, as a primary case study. Ethan sat back, surprised. They're studying what happened. They're studying how the system failed that day, and more importantly, how it needs to change so that the next time a team is surrounded with a man bleeding out, the tasked response doesn't take 25 minutes just because the nearest asset happened to be that far away. Vance told me the review board's findings actually cited my decision, not as a template for pilots to start ignoring orders. He was very clear about that part, but as evidence that the current response framework has gaps that need addressing. Faster escalation protocols. Better real-time coordination between assets that happen to be in range, even if they're not formally tasked. She shook her head slowly, still visibly stunned by the whole thing. The thing I did because the system failed is now the reason the system is getting fixed. Ethan felt something warm settle in his chest, a quiet, profound satisfaction that went beyond even the gratitude he already carried for what she'd done in that valley. So Danny Coleman almost died because the framework was too slow. And because of what you did that day, defying that framework, the framework itself is getting rebuilt so it doesn't happen to the next team. That's about the size of it, yeah. That's not just heroism, Olivia. That's a legacy. She looked down at her hands, something humble and uncertain crossing her face. The same quality Ethan had noticed in her from the very first moment they'd met in person. The striking gap between how fearlessly she'd flown into that valley and how genuinely modest she remained about what it had meant. I don't know about legacy. I just didn't want anyone else's mother getting a phone call that started with, "We regret to inform you." I know. That's exactly what makes it a legacy. Ethan leaned forward. You didn't do what you did for recognition. You didn't do it to become a case study or get invited to backyard gatherings where grown men cry while thanking you. You did it because in that exact moment, you were the only person who could change the outcome, and you refused to let procedure be the reason 8 men didn't come home. That's the whole story, Olivia. That's all it ever was. Later that evening, standing on the flight line as the sun dropped low over the runway, painting the sky in the kind of deep orange that pilots learn to love, because it means the day's flying is almost done and everyone made it back safely, Ethan thought about the question the review board had asked Olivia all those months ago, in that quiet, formal room where her entire career had hung in the balance. Why did you do it? Her answer had been 3 words: because they needed help. No elaboration, no speech about duty or courage or sacrifice. Just the simplest, most honest truth a person could offer, stripped down to its essential core. And Ethan understood now, standing on that flight line with the sound of engines somewhere in the distance and 8 men alive who otherwise wouldn't be, that those 3 words carried more weight than any medal ceremony, any commendation, any formal recognition the military could have offered her instead. Because they needed help. That was the whole answer. That had always been the whole answer. Somewhere out there, right now, in valleys and cities and quiet corners of the world nobody else was watching, there were people just like Olivia Carter, ordinary until the moment demanded otherwise, carrying inside them the capacity to do something extraordinary the instant it actually mattered. Most of them never got tested. Most of them went through entire lives without ever finding out what they would have done if the radio had crackled with a stranger's desperate voice and the math had come out impossible. But some of them did get tested. Some of them heard the call, ran the numbers, understood exactly what it would cost them, and turned toward the danger anyway. Not because a title required it of them, not because a rule book demanded it, but because somewhere underneath the training and the procedure and the careful practiced calm, they were simply, fundamentally, the kind of person who couldn't fly past a valley full of dying strangers and call it someone else's problem. Captain Olivia Carter never set out to become a hero. She never wanted the label, never sought the recognition, never once, in any of the months that followed, described herself as anything other than a pilot who happened to be in the right place with the right amount of fuel and the right amount of courage on the worst day of 8 men's lives. But heroism was never about the title in the first place. It never needed one. It needed 6 minutes, a stubborn refusal to turn back, and one person willing to believe, against every rule written to stop her, that there was still a chance worth risking everything for. And because Olivia Carter believed that, 8 American soldiers walked out of a valley they were never supposed to survive, carried home not by procedure, not by the system that was designed to save them, but by the fierce, unbreakable will of one woman who heard a stranger's voice on a dying radio channel and simply, without hesitation, chose to come. 1 year to the day after Danny Coleman had been carried out of that valley on the edge of death, Ethan Walker stood at the edge of a different kind of gathering, this one far larger than the quiet backyard reunion that had marked their first year together, and watched Olivia Carter step up to a podium wearing a new set of oak leaves on her collar that hadn't been there 12 months earlier. "Major Carter?" Ethan said under his breath, testing the sound of it, and beside him Coleman, standing now without any cane at all, grinned like it was his own promotion being announced. "Feels right, doesn't it, Cap?" "Feels earned." The promotion ceremony wasn't the reason they had all traveled out to the base that weekend. Not really, though it had turned into a happy convergence of timing that nobody had quite planned. The real reason was smaller, quieter, something that had started as an offhand comment from Sullivan almost a year earlier and had slowly, stubbornly grown into something none of them expected. It had started the way most good things started with that team, which was to say, over beer and bad jokes about who had cried the most during the backyard reunion the previous summer. Sullivan, 3 drinks in, had said something about how strange it was that an entire team owed their lives to a total stranger and a radio frequency that happened to overlap by pure chance. And Harmon, in that flat, thoughtful way he had said maybe chance wasn't quite the right word for it. Maybe it was more like the kind of thing that should happen on purpose for other people the next time. That conversation had turned into a plan. The plan had turned into paperwork, meetings, budget requests, the kind of grinding administrative effort that never showed up in the parts of the story anyone wanted to tell, but which mattered enormously to the 8 men and 1 pilot who kept pushing it forward anyway. And now, a year later, standing on a stretch of tarmac at the edge of the base, that plan had become something real. A small memorial marker, unassuming, practical in the way military memorials often were, engraved with a single radio call sign and a date, positioned near the squadron ready room, where pilots would walk past it on their way to every single flight for years to come. Beneath the call sign, a short inscription that the whole team had argued about for weeks before finally agreeing on wording simple enough to mean everything without needing to explain itself. She heard, she came, she stayed. Olivia hadn't known about the marker until the morning of the ceremony, when Ethan had walked her over to the spot, unveiled it, and watched her go completely silent for almost a full minute, one hand pressed against her mouth, eyes bright with tears she was fighting hard not to let fall in front of an audience. "You didn't have to do this," she finally managed. "We know," Coleman said, standing beside her with the easy confidence of a man who'd learned, over the past year, exactly how to hold his ground even in moments too big for words. That's kind of the point. The promotion ceremony that followed later that afternoon felt, in some strange way, like an extension of that same gesture. The Air Force's own formal acknowledgement layered on top of the informal one her rescued team had already given her months earlier. Colonel Vance, the same man who had once stood in his office and told her that decision alone was grounds for suspension, now stood at a podium reading her promotion citation aloud. his voice carrying none of that old fury, only something that sounded unmistakably like pride. For exceptional judgment under extreme pressure, and for a body of work over the past year contributing directly to the revision of close air support response protocols across the command, protocols that have since been credited with reducing average critical casualty response time by nearly 40% across 3 separate engagements. Ethan glanced sideways at Coleman during that line, and Coleman met his eyes with a small, knowing nod. 3 separate engagements. 3 teams somewhere out there who would never know Olivia Carter's name, who would never sit in a hospital bed listening to a video message from a pilot who hadn't known theirs either, but who had come home anyway because a system had finally learned, the hard way, exactly how fast it needed to move. After the ceremony wound down, after the handshakes and photographs, and the particular exhaustion that comes from standing in dress uniform under a hot sun for 2 hours, the team found their way to a private corner of the base recreation area, the same loose, easy group that had first gathered in that backyard a year earlier. Though a few new faces had joined them since then. Dawson was there, Olivia's wingman through everything, grinning in a way that suggested he'd finally, fully forgiven her for scaring a decade off his life over that valley. And beside him stood a woman Ethan hadn't met before, introduced simply as Sarah, Dawson's wife, who apparently had heard the entire story so many times over the past year that she could recite parts of the radio transcript from memory, much to Dawson's visible embarrassment. "He talks about it constantly," Sarah said, laughing, swatting Dawson's arm when he tried to protest. "Every anniversary dinner for the rest of our lives, I already know what the toast is going to be about." "It's a good story," Dawson said, mock defensive. "People should hear good stories." "It's the only story," Sarah shot back. And the whole group laughed, the easy, warm laughter of people who had earned the right to make jokes about the worst day of their lives because they had all survived it together. There was someone else there too, someone Olivia hadn't expected, standing a little apart from the group at first, watching with the careful, uncertain posture of a man who wasn't entirely sure he belonged. Her father. Olivia noticed him before anyone else did, and for a moment she just stood there, frozen, processing the sight of him in a place she'd never once imagined him standing, surrounded by the very people whose lives had been shaped by the choice he'd once, quietly, disapproved of. "You came," she said, walking over slowly, unsure what to say beyond that. "Ethan called me," her father admitted, glancing toward where Ethan stood a few yards away, pretending very unconvincingly not to be listening. "Said something about how a man ought to see what his daughter's built with her life, instead of just hearing about it secondhand." Olivia turned toward Ethan, eyebrows raised, and he shrugged, entirely unashamed. "Found his number in the letter you told me about. Figured a father who wrote something that honest deserved to see the rest of the story in person." Her father cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable in the way men of his generation often were when emotion pressed too close to the surface. "I read that citation they read out today. 40% faster response time, 3 engagements." He shook his head slowly. "I spent years thinking you chose danger over sense, Liv. Took me until today, standing here meeting these men, to understand you didn't choose danger at all. You chose to be the kind of person who shows up. That's not the same thing. I should have seen that a long time ago." Olivia didn't trust her voice enough to answer, so she simply hugged him instead, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the entire distance of years and misunderstanding compressing down into something that finally, quietly resolved itself. "Your mother would have been proud too," he added eventually, voice rough. "I know I don't say that enough about either of you." "You just said it. That's enough." The gathering stretched late into the evening, stories layering on top of stories the way they always did whenever this particular group came together, Ortiz retelling the Valley firefight with increasingly theatrical embellishments that had Cole rolling his eyes and correcting him every 3 sentences, Briggs quietly showing photos of a daughter born 8 months after that deployment, a little girl he'd almost never met, passed carefully around the group with the reverence such photos always carried among men who understood exactly how close they'd come to not existing to see them grow up. At some point, Coleman pulled Olivia aside away from the noise of the group, and the two of them sat together on a low wall at the edge of the recreation area, quiet for a while before Coleman finally spoke. "I never got the chance to tell you something, not properly. You've told me plenty. That backyard hug alone said more than most speeches I've heard." "Not this." Coleman looked down at his hands, turning something over in his mind before continuing. That day, right before you got there, when Doc had his hands on me and I could feel myself kind of drifting, I remember thinking about my mom, about how she was going to get a phone call, and how unfair it felt that the last thing I'd ever say to her wasn't going to be something I got to choose. He paused, swallowing hard. And then I heard your voice on the radio, 6 minutes, and something in me just decided to believe it. Decided that if a stranger was willing to say those words with that much certainty, maybe I could hold on long enough to see if she meant it. Olivia's eyes had gone bright, and she didn't try to hide it this time. I did mean it. I know. I know you did. That's what I wanted to say. Not thank you for the flying, not thank you for the cannon, though obviously, yeah, that too. Thank you for the 6 minutes, for giving me something to hold on to when I didn't have anything else left. That's the thing I think about most, actually. Not the gunfire, the moment I decided to believe a stranger's voice instead of giving up. Olivia reached over and squeezed his hand, unable to find words adequate enough to match what he'd just given her. And for a while, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the rest of the group laugh and talk in the distance, watching Ethan explain something animatedly to Olivia's father, while Dawson mimed what appeared to be an increasingly exaggerated recreation of the Danger Close gun run, much to Sarah's visible amusement. It was Ethan who eventually raised his glass one final time that evening, drawing the whole group's attention, and Olivia recognized the particular quality in his voice. The same steady, grounded authority that had once held a surrounded team together through 15 minutes of impossible odds. A year ago, he began, 8 men walked into a valley that nearly became 8 graves. We survived because one pilot decided a stranger's life mattered more than her own career, more than procedure, more than every rule written specifically to stop her from doing exactly what she did. That decision cost her 30 days of grounding, a formal reprimand, and probably more sleepless nights than she'll ever admit to us. He glanced at Olivia, who gave a small, rueful nod of confirmation. But it also, as it turns out, rewrote the rulebook for how fast this country responds when the next team finds itself surrounded and out of time. 3 engagements since, 3 teams who came home faster because Olivia Carter refused to accept that 25 minutes was good enough when 10 was all a man had left. He raised his glass higher. To Valkyrie, who taught an entire branch of the military that sometimes the fastest way to save a life is to stop asking permission first. To Valkyrie, the whole group echoed, glasses raised, and Olivia sat there in the middle of them, overwhelmed in the particular way that only comes from being surrounded by proof that a single decision, made in 6 impossible minutes, had rippled outward into something far larger than she could have ever imagined standing in that cockpit a year earlier. Later, as the gathering finally began to wind down and people started drifting toward their cars, Olivia found herself standing once more beside the small memorial marker near the squadron ready room, alone this time, reading the inscription over again in the fading evening light. She heard. She came. She stayed. She thought about that valley often, more than she let anyone know, replaying the 6 minutes that had defined the rest of her life, the static crackling through her headset, the terror in Ethan's voice, Dawson's warnings, the moment she'd banked the aircraft hard and pointed the nose toward coordinates she had no authorization to approach. She thought about how close she'd come to letting the fear win, to letting Dawson's caution talk her out of it, to becoming the version of herself who simply followed the flight plan and never knew what she'd left behind in that valley. She thought, too, about something Colonel Vance had told her, weeks after the review board's decision, in a conversation she'd carried with her ever since. Sometimes the exception proves why the rule exists in the first place. She understood that differently now, a year removed from the fear and adrenaline of the moment itself. The rules existed because most of the time, most decisions needed the careful, deliberate weight of an entire chain of command behind them, needed the caution that prevented good intentions from becoming reckless mistakes. But every so often, life produced a moment so narrow, so unforgiving, that waiting for permission became its own kind of failure. And when that moment arrived, somebody had to be willing to become the exception, not carelessly, not without understanding exactly what it might cost, but with clear eyes and a full accounting of the risk, choosing anyway. That was the whole lesson, really. Not that rules didn't matter, not that procedure was something to be dismissed whenever it felt inconvenient, but that somewhere underneath every rule book ever written, there had to remain room for a person who heard a stranger's voice on a dying radio channel and simply, without hesitation, decided that voice was worth everything they had. Footsteps approached behind her, and she turned to find Ethan there, hands in his pockets, watching her with the quiet understanding of a man who had learned, over the past year, exactly how to read the weight behind her silences. Thinking about the valley again, always this time of year. She looked back at the marker. You know what's strange? I used to think the bravest thing I ever did was turn that aircraft around. But standing here now, I think the bravest thing was actually staying after. Circling that valley when I had every reason to leave, when command had already ordered me home twice, when the smart move, the safe move, would have been to break off and let the medevac handle the rest. Why'd you stay? Because leaving felt like only doing half the job. Getting you out of immediate danger wasn't the same as making sure Danny actually made it. I couldn't leave not knowing. She shook her head slightly. I think that's the part people miss sometimes when they tell this story. It wasn't just the 6 minutes to get there. It was every minute after too, the ones where I could have safely disappeared and nobody would have blamed me, and I chose to stay anyway. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding settling into his expression. That's the part I always tell people, actually. Anybody can make one brave decision under pressure, in the heat of the moment, with adrenaline doing half the work. What you did was different. You kept choosing it over and over. Every single minute that valley gave you a chance to leave, and you didn't take it. They stood together in silence for a while longer, the base slowly quieting around them as the last of the gathering dispersed into the evening. And Olivia found herself thinking, not for the first time, about how strange and beautiful it was that a single radio frequency, overlapping by pure chance on an otherwise unremarkable training flight, had connected her entire life to a group of strangers she now considered family in every way that mattered. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Anything. Do you ever think about how many other teams are out there right now in some valley somewhere, hoping for their own 6 minutes? Hoping some stranger happens to be close enough and brave enough to break the rules for them? Ethan considered the question for a long moment before answering. I think about it constantly, but I also think that's exactly why what you did matters so much beyond just our team. Because of you, the system got faster. Because of you, the next team's 6 minutes might actually come from someone who's tasked to help them. Someone who doesn't have to break every rule in the book just to reach them in time. He looked at her steadily. You didn't just save 8 men in that valley, Olivia. You made it so the next 8 men have a better chance of not needing a miracle at all. Olivia let that settle over her, the weight of it both humbling and somehow deeply satisfying. And she looked out toward the darkening horizon where somewhere hundreds of miles away, an A-10 sat waiting on a flight line for the next morning's mission. Ordinary, routine, exactly the kind of unremarkable sortie that had once, impossibly, changed everything. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I'd fly that 6 minutes again tomorrow. No hesitation. I know, Ethan said, smiling. That's exactly why we built you a marker instead of a monument. Monuments are for endings. This is for the next beginning, whenever it comes. She smiled back, and together they walked back toward the lights and laughter of the group still gathered nearby, leaving the small marker standing quietly behind them in the settling dark. A permanent reminder etched in 3 simple lines that would greet every pilot who ever walked that path toward their own aircraft, toward their own version of 6 minutes, toward whatever moment might one day ask them the same impossible question it had once asked Olivia Carter in a cockpit 500 miles from a valley she had no business entering. She heard, she came, she stayed, and because she did, 8 men who should never have made it home were standing right there in that gathering, alive, whole, and grateful. Proof beyond any doubt that one person's refusal to accept the unacceptable could still, even now, even in a world built on procedure and protocol, change absolutely everything. That was the story. That had always been the story, not of rules broken, not of careers risked, but of one simple, unshakable truth that Olivia Carter had proven with her own hands on the worst and best day of her life. Sometimes all it takes to change everything is one person deciding there's still a chance worth taking.